stuff. You've had a good time hearing about tech, society. You're going to have a session on culture later on. We're going to talk about the very serious and daunting stuff. Anyway, delighted to be here, seeing so many friends in this room. Delighted to hear my colleagues here. I will introduce them very shortly. This session has a very grand title, and obviously I don't expect we covering this and sorting it in the next hour. We'll try our best, though. We've got some very smart minds here, so I expect they will come up with some good ideas. I think we should perhaps limit ourselves to what has been happening under the current leader, Xi Jinping, who came to power, as all of you in this room know, 13 years ago. And perhaps the main question we should be asking ourselves is what has changed with regard to China's role on the international scene since he came to power. So first, the years 2013 to 2016 were about consolidating power and also perhaps asserting power globally, at least showing some signs. Launching the Belt and Road Initiative, launching the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, strengthening the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, enhancing the China-Africa partnership, enhancing ties with the Eastern European bloc. We heard about it this morning from Justina, the famous, now defunct almost, 16+1 mechanism. And of course, a growing and accelerating rivalry with the United States. 2017, very important 19th Party Congress, of course, where Xi declared that the Chinese nation now stood tall and firm in the East, and he discussed trends of multipolarity and predicted the erosion of US power. Remember also that the 19th Party Congress explicitly referenced the deadline of 2049 for making the PLA, the People's Liberation Army, into a world-class military. In addition, Xi Jinping's second term sent conflicting signals about whether China intends to support a rules-based international order. I'm afraid you're going to hear about that a couple of times today. Think about the South China Sea, for example. Then we had the 20th Party Congress in 2022, which took place in a much deteriorated international environment. The statement referred to a gloomier outlook with changes of a magnitude not seen in a century. It refers to China's Global Development Initiative and Global Security Initiative, two schemes announced by Chairman Xi in 2021 and 2022, respectively. So, of course, on top of this, you had the war in Ukraine, which was launched by Vladimir Putin, and no need to repeat that, and following his visits to Beijing, and the close partnership between Russia and China. So we're not going to talk too much about EU-China relations. I think we've covered that. We need to say something about US-China relations, and we do have somebody from the United States, my colleague Lyle Morris. We have Marc Julien, who is the director of the Center for Asian Studies at IFRI, the French Institute for International Relations. So we're going to hear from Marc on the EU's views on China's rise and what I call China's assertiveness on the global order. We're going to hear from our friend Wang Zichen from the Center for China and Globalization based in Beijing. So he came all the way from Beijing. Thanks very much for that. And Zichen was just spent a year in the US and at Princeton University. And I think he will have a very interesting perspective. Lyle is in charge of the national security and foreign policy pillar at the Center for China Analysis, my center, in New York, sorry, in Washington, and he was previously at the Department of Defense. And last but not least, Simona Grano, who is also with the CCA, who is based in Zurich, and who is the head of the Taiwan China research area at the University of Zurich, and a senior fellow on Taiwan at the Center for China Analysis. So, what I suggest is perhaps we start with Mark, and I would love to hear how you feel. I mean, I've covered very briefly the past 12 or 13 years. There's a lot happening. There's an acceleration of history. Many people have written about that, including your colleague, Thomas Gomar. How, from your point of view, as somebody who's traveled to Asia extensively, how do you see this? How do Europeans and European analysts see this rise? Then perhaps I'll ask the same question to Lyle after that. Mark, you have.
Thank you very much, Felix. It's working. Thank you very much for having me today. I'm delighted to be here in this wonderful place. Congratulations to Asia Society for this wonderful event. I'm very happy to be part of it and to share this wonderful panel. So, a European perspective on the China's rise. I may choose the easy start, starting with 2019 and this, threefold qualification of China, which is, partnership, competitor, qualifying China as a partner, a competitor, and a systemic rival. So this was back in 2029, and things have evolved quite drastically ever since, because at that time, these three pillars of partnership, competition, and systemic rivalry was quite consensual among Europeans, because any country, member states could choose whether China is more a partner, more a competitor, or more a systemic rival. Unfortunately, it seems that now in 2025, it seems that the third pillar is now much more prominent in how Europeans view China, and I would choose three main reasons, three main arguments for that. First of all, it will be because usually the systemic, before that, the systemic rivalry were mostly conceptual, meaning that to acknowledge that Europe and China have different views, different definition of what is democracy, what are human rights, or what is rule of law. Agree to disagree, but at least we don't have the same definition, and China is willing to promote those definitions, its own concept within the United Nations. So again, agree to disagree, but we have to acknowledge that we disagree on those points. So this was perhaps the origin of this systemic rivalry. Now it's much more concrete, much more immediate, because we have a very immediate crisis, especially on the European soil, where we cannot ignore the position of China. Obviously, I'm talking about the war in Ukraine. China has a neutrality stance in this war. However, in Chinese view, neutrality means not providing weapons to any side of the conflict, but China still blame one of the two sides, which is the Europeans, the United States, and NATO. And so being neutral is not, a neutral state is not supposed to put the blame on one of the two parties. So this is something that is creating strong distrust within European leaders and European parliaments. And this is something that touches directly European security and the stability and some would say is a vital issue for the European Union as a whole. The second issue is the Taiwan Strait question. Of course, the whole European Union and member states recognize the one China policy, and this is not something that is changing or is going to change. However, there is still the question of the strait. And the strait has always been recognized by European Union, European member states, has an international maritime route, and one which is absolutely crucial for free trade and for global trade. This is something that is crucial for the European industry, for our supply chain, and as a matter of fact, Europeans acknowledge and witness that the security and stability in the Strait is degrading, and this poses a risk and concerns for European, and this is a topic that is difficult to discuss with the Chinese side. And last but not least, the last point, which used to be within the partner pillar, or also even in the competitor pillar, which is trade. Trade used to be used to bear many opportunities for Europeans, including for France. When we discussed some sensitive issue with the Chinese, we knew that after that we would talk about trade and everything would go right. But now even trade has become a very sensitive and complicated issue with the Chinese, because there is now less and less opportunities for both sides and more challenges, especially because let's take the most obvious example, which is the automotive industry and the EV, electric vehicle industry. I don't want to dig into the debate of who is responsible for what. Clearly, the Europeans have not moved faster enough in this realm. China also bears some responsibility in terms of subsidies and so on and so forth. But I think both sides need to recognize that we are each facing a very, very strong dilemma. Europe is facing a strong dilemma because it is lagging behind in those technology, in the electric vehicle sector, but it has a huge industry. It's more than 3 million jobs across Europe. And it's not only about France or Germany, it concerns almost all member states in Europe. Everybody has a role in the automotive supply chain. So this is something that we cannot ignore. And by the way, in China, Weiwen, the maintaining stability, is a very core concept of the Communist Party. So this is something that is somehow also true in Europe. We also have our leaders, the European Union needs to safeguard our social stability. And with this large industry covering the whole Europe, the competitiveness of China bears huge risk for those 3 million jobs, and this could have very, very serious consequences for the social stability, economic stability, and political stability of Europe. So this is something that we take very, very seriously. This is our problem, but China also needs to acknowledge that we are facing this very strong problem. And on the other way around, Europe also needs to acknowledge that China is also facing a very, very strong dilemma. China's economy is not in a very good shape these days, and it needs to, since the domestic demand is very, very low, consumption is very low, it needs to produce a lot in order to produce wealth, to produce growth, and it needs to export this production. So we have to acknowledge also that China is facing very, very strong challenges at home when it comes to employment, to economic growth, and it needs to export. So at some point, we need to compromise, we need to acknowledge each other's dilemma and to negotiate and find a compromise. Usually we finish on a positive note, but we are just a few days, a couple of weeks before the EU-China summit in Beijing, and I must be honest, I'm not very, very optimistic in the sense that I don't really see both parties moving forward each other, and that's a problem because China and Europe is facing a trade war with the United States. So if there was a momentum to work together, it would have been perhaps now, but I don't see any positive options coming out anytime soon. So just to conclude, China is more and more regarded from Europe as a challenge in terms of the global order because of trade, globally speaking, but also because of the role China plays at the international level in the UN, but also in international crisis, especially in the Ukrainian war, which is the most important security and diplomatic issue for you Europeans. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mark. And the good thing is I've asked you to speak first, so you've done all the negative stuff, and now I'm going to turn to Lyle, who comes from Washington, who's going to give us so many good news about US-China relations. And so Lyle, to be serious, I mean, because it's not really a laughing matter, but what would be the security and defense implications of the US-China competition, particularly in the Indo-Pacific, since this is the region which we haven't spoken about too much today, but actually it's a region of huge tensions. Later on, Simona will address the Taiwan issue, but we can talk about the South China Sea, we can talk about the military competition, and of course, we are under a relatively recent administration, which has done quite a few things since January, but I'd love to hear your thoughts about all of this.
Thanks, Philippe. I'm sorry to disappoint, but I may continue the maybe a little bit pessimistic view from Washington, but I think it's important to share. So when Philippe reached out to the panel and talked to me, he asked me to share the view from DC about China and the Indo-Pacific, and in particular the Trump administration's policy to the extent that we know what it is. And to be sure, we actually don't have a clear document that lays out Trump's Indo-Pacific strategy, but I think there's a few kind of foreshadowing and speeches that I'll highlight today that I think gives us a good sense of where he's going with China and the Indo-Pacific. So in the next 5 to 6 minutes, hopefully I'll kind of touch on the key points and then open up to Q&A for anyone who wants to ask me a question about the U.S. policy. So first I'm going to frame what I see as the Trump administration's Indo-Pacific strategy from a DC perspective, in particular from the DoD and a military perspective. The second, I'm going to highlight Secretary of Defense Pete Hegseth's recent remarks at the Shangri-La Dialogue, because I think that's important, and I think it gives a good sense of where DoD is going on China. And then finally, I'll talk about what it means for allies and partners, in particular, what it means for Europe. Just to be clear, I'm not advocating Trump's policies, I'm not supporting them, but I do think it's important to outline or describe where I think it's going, what it means for China, what it means for the Indo-Pacific, because we're going to be in this world for the next 3.5 years, so I think it's important. So 6 months into Trump's second term, I think it's safe to say, no surprise to anyone, that he's generated, I think it's safe to say, dismay and confusion at home and abroad. I don't need to lay out the reasons why. Tariffs on allies and adversaries, very blunt criticism of our closest partners. They appear to be arbitrary and destructive, and I fully admit that. But the first point I'll make is I think there's an element of logic to his policies on the Indo-Pacific, especially when it comes to national security. So basically, in a nutshell, he sees previous U.S. strategy aimed to build and maintain a global order led by the United States as misguided, and he said this repeatedly. He thinks it's sapped U.S. power abroad. He views the U.S.'s moves to cultivate soft power as leading to meddling and overstretch, and he perceives credible security guarantees as encouraging some of the United States allies to reduce their own efforts and rely on U.S. protection. So that's, from my perspective, what is animating his rhetoric. Instead of trying to create a global order, I would argue that the current Trump administration appears to be pursuing a very focused strategy of prioritization. The reasoning is simple. The U.S. has limited resources, and China is currently the greatest geopolitical threat from D.C. So therefore, Washington must energize allies around the world to manage their own regions, freeing up the US to concentrate on Asia. The principles of prioritization predate the Trump administration, and they will likely endure beyond it. Every US president since Barack Obama has tried to pivot to Asia with a focus from Europe to Asia, because they all have understood that the greater threat to the US lies in Asia. So that's my first point. I think we might not like it, we might not agree, but that's where Trump's national security team is at, and that's what his documents appear to say, that the Asia and China is the primary threat and primary strategic consideration for the US and for DoD. My second point is, I think Pete Hegseth's speech at Shangri-La in Singapore was probably the best indicator we have of where DoD's thinking is on the Indo-Pacific and China. So I'm going to quote a few of his speech, because I think it's important to kind of just level set with how we and how DoD views China. So first of all, his speech is very China-centered. Again, not a surprise to other Secretary of Defense's speeches in the Shangri-La dialogue. So he talked about China as the single most important national security priority after the defense of the US homeland. He warned, for example, that China seeks to become a hegemonic power in Asia and dominate and control the Indo-Pacific region. The overall goal from his perspective and from the US strategy then must be to, quote, ensure that China is not allowed to dominate us, to dominate US allies and partners. He also went on to note that the most likely theater of China's aggression is Taiwan, where he said an attempt to conquer the self-governing island by force could be imminent. And the imminent phrase was actually the first time that any Secretary of Defense has used that word, so it was noteworthy. He also said President Trump has said that China will, quote, not invade Taiwan on his watch. And so the US DoD's goal is to prevent war, to make the cost too high, and that peace is the only option. Borrowing further from Trump's peace through strength approach, Hegseth declared that prioritizing forward-postured, combat-credible forces in the Western Pacific to deter by denial along the first and second island chains would be DoD's foremost priority. So Hegseth's remarks are founded on the interim national security strategic guidance for March 2025. This is the first kind of planning document that we have that talks about Trump's policy towards the Indo-Pacific. So this guidance will feed into the administration's national defense strategy, which is expected to be completed by August of this year. The guidance is framed as ensuring that none of the key regions today, the Indo-Pacific, Europe, and the Middle East, are allowed to fall under the hegemony of US rivals, namely China, Russia, and Iran. But since only one of the three regions, the Indo-Pacific, could potentially fall under dominance of a rival power in China, the foremost objective in Trump's global strategy after the defense of the US homeland is to prevent China from imposing regional hegemony in the Indo-Pacific. Again, and just one final note on his speech, he talked about, in the interim national security guidance, talked about China is the US's sole pacing threat. Biden's guidance talked about pacing challenge, that China is a pacing challenge. So the threat, the change from challenge to threat is noteworthy, and I think that's widely shared within the current Trump administration's DoD advisors. Finally, on the Hegseth speech, I think it's important to point out that, and again, some of us might discount what he said, but I think it's still noteworthy to point it out nonetheless. He did talk about, his exact quote was, the US considers China a threat, not the Chinese people, but it is the Chinese Communist Party and the PLA that worries us most. He said the US does not seek to humiliate China, respects Chinese people, their civilization, and does not intend to pursue regime change. So again, it's something that has been included in many other SecDef speeches, but it's noteworthy that he included it in his. So just to end on implications for US allies and partners. So As it has done with Europe, the Trump administration expects more from its partners and allies in terms of burden sharing. Countries in Asia, Higgs has said, should take inspiration from increased defense spending in Europe. Indeed, the Trump administration hopes partners and allies in Asia will spend 5% of GDP on defense. NATO's recent announcement that its members agreed to this target by 2035 is certainly a welcome development in DC for the US and for Europe, and it may hopefully put to rest an irritant in the transatlantic alliance under Trump. So just to conclude on 3 points and implications, first, what does the US Indo-Pacific strategy mean for, towards China mean for our allies? Basically, it's continuity, that the US and DoD remains focused on China and the challenge from China as the primary geostrategic area of focus for the future. As Higgs has said, the US must prepare to prevent and deter war in all theaters, but most importantly in the Indo-Pacific. Second, the demonstration of a stronger commitment from EU and NATO nations to the Indo-Pacific is accompanied by the challenge to define a common strategy and coordinate forces that will be sustainable if competition turns into confrontation. Such a confrontation would test the credibility of NATO and its partners' force postures, which is still focused on the threat from Russia. Finally, the US and the EU, I believe, need to continue to coordinate on how to balance assets and strategy when it comes to the 2 primary theaters of concern, which is China and the Indo-Pacific and Russia and Eurasia. As we have seen with North Korea sending troops to Ukraine, I believe the 2 theaters are more closely linked than we might believe. But decisions on how to balance strategic attention will need to be debated and discussed between Washington and Brussels. That's all in there. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Lyle. I'd like to dive into more the Asia-Pacific region, or the Indo-Pacific region, as some of us call it. Si Cheng, I forgot to mention that you're also the editor of the Pekingnology newsletter, which I'm sure a number of people in this room are subscribers of, and I'd love to hear more about it at some point. But again, you've been spending a year in the US, and you're obviously a fluent English speaker. You've been in and out of China for many years. But what is it between a China that used to be keen on, say, dominating Asia, and that potentially wants to influence the global order? Is there a discrepancy between this regional approach and this, say, global approach, or do you see things in a different approach? But thank you very much for being here.
Thank you for the opportunity. I want to start by thanking Asia Society and Duncan and Jing Qian, and also I had the opportunity of to go to Salzburg Global Seminar last year, so it's really a pleasure to be here. And these are wonderful questions you just asked. Fundamentally, I don't think China wants to dominate Asia, much less the entire world. And I know this is perhaps not the consensus or very well received views in Europe or elsewhere in the West. I think, for example, when it comes to talk about Asia, people talk about South China Sea, right? The Chinese-Filipino standoff was on headlines for quite a few weeks and months. But as we speak now, Vietnam is, building artificial islands, doing land reclamation in South China Sea at a significant speed. Malaysia is drilling oil and oil and gas projects in South China Sea. Indonesia was, driving off Chinese vessels with its own vessels. And, there was a leaked Chinese diplomatic note to the embassy in Beijing, which was first reported by local media, not in the Chinese media. So basically, all these things are also happening, but you don't see too much of a pushback, much less the level of pushback when it comes to Philippines, from Beijing. So I think yes, China maintains, for example, a so-called 9-dash line, but the 9-dash line was not created by the Communist Party of China or the current Chinese government. It was inherited from the Republic of China under Kuomintang, which then fled to Taiwan after China's civil war. It's politically very difficult for a succeeding government to renounce, territorial claims from a previous government. That's politically just very difficult. And to be very, very clear, the 9-dash line is not China's legal claim to its territory. Put it in another way, China does not claim that everything within the 9-dash line falls into Chinese territory. And China has basically promoted Belt and Road Initiative, so with a lot of developments across the world, a lot of which have been given the tag called death trap diplomacy. And I think the poster boy in Western mainstream narrative for death trap diplomacy would be Sri Lanka. In the most well-read, reputable newspaper in the world, you have 2 or 3 dedicated long stories about basically how China trapped Sri Lanka into basically a 99-year lease of a key port over there. But when you really examine the sort of stories, when the Chinese survey ship Yuan Wang 5 wanted to dock there, it's not even a warship, because of political pressure from India. Sri Lanka was very unwilling to let even the Chinese survey ship to dock there. So after quite some diplomatic back and forth, the Chinese survey ship was able to dock there, but following that, Sri Lanka announced, for example, a 1-year ban on Navy visits to its ports. And actually, as reported by mainstream local Sri Lanka media, the Chinese ambassador there in March of this year conceded that the Chinese state lender actually recognizes $6 or $7 billion losses due to its investment in Sri Lanka. And if that's debt trap diplomacy, by $7 billion can't even secure a Chinese survey ship docking rights in Sri Lanka, I don't know what kind of debt trap, how successful it actually is. So I think there is this fundamental disagreement with the Western narrative that China was trying to seek dominance in Asia, much less in the world. I think the record has been that Beijing has been unable to and it doesn't have the willingness or the capacity or its willingness to actually impose cost or devote tremendous resources to change the behavior of its neighbors. For example, I think North Korea is still developing, by all public accounts, nuclear weapons. There is limited Chinese effect on that front. There is this very recent, for example, Thailand-Cambodia row, which seems to be very, very serious, and you don't see China getting there to play a broker role. And I think the Chinese point of view globally, for to come back to the larger question, there is. It is still a developing country with a GDP per capita at $13,000. It ranks like something like 70th in the world. It is on par with the lowest GDP per capita in the entire 27 member state of the European Union. So the priority of the Chinese government, and also try to invoke the term "weiwen," which just came up a few minutes ago, is about maintain domestic political stability. It's not in the Chinese Communist Party or governmental interest to have a world that is chaotic, that is having wars. The Chinese look for a external environment that is conducive to continue its economic growth, to make the lives better for its people. I think President and General Secretary Xi Jinping has said it a number of times. It's laid out in all the Chinese Communist Party documents and government papers that to manage its own affairs well, that is the fundamental, the most important task for the governing party and for the Chinese nation. And in more recent, I think it's always good to look back at the history a little bit. China has 14 land borders. China has resolved 12 of them, 12 borders with them, like over 90% of the 22,000 kilometers on land. China hasn't fought a war for quite some decades. The PLA doesn't have any real combat experience. Unfortunately, there was a border standstill with India in 2020, which, both sides have disengaged its troops. And the other remaining country is Bhutan, which is under the influence of India. And so I think China amended its relations in the past few years. For example, there is no additional tariffs on Australian exports to China. China just began resuming its seafood import from Japan. And China and India is trying to get a little bit better. I think personally, I do hope that there is a better flexibility and a bigger awareness of China of its own impact, including some of its foreign policy decisions and even its internal domestic decisions that will have a outsized, larger impact on its neighbors and on the world. I think for the world's second largest economy, which is still haunted by its memories since 1840, which is a country being colonized, being invaded, being bullied, the sort of victimhood that it should be on the defensive. It needs to stand very firm against any single attempt of what China perceives to be unfriendly behavior, especially from the Western powers to China. I think that should, helpfully, that could go away, and China should be more aware that whatever decision it makes, it should have it will cause impacts across the world, so that it's in Chinese interest to basically exercise even more restraint as it has been for the past few decades. I don't think the Chinese are actively going out to look out for trouble, to try to kick off the United States off the throne of the world, although the US seems to be withdrawing itself proactively. But I don't see China going out try to fill the leadership vacuum actively. I think the Chinese lesson from the recent decades of US experience is that the wars in various regions of the world is costly. It didn't bring much, or if any, of the real benefits back to the people. And if you really examine the Chinese domestic discussions, I think there is significant pushback from the Chinese general public against Chinese aid to development aid to foreign countries. The Chinese people generally believe that there are so many problems to be solved domestically, and this should be the priority at home. And I'm sorry I took up too long time. Happy to engage in further.
Very clear cut. Very clear. Thank you very much. I'll get back to you at some point. But you've mentioned that the PLA has no combat experience. And in a few days from now, there'll be a military exercise in the Taiwan Strait. And this gives me a great opportunity to introduce Simona. Is the Taiwan question, which is very much on a lot of people's mind, will it have a global impact? Does it already have a global impact? And is this one of the major international questions that we have to look at as China analysts? And generally, how do you see the situation evolving with the upcoming drills I just referred to? Do you think the PLA has no intention of attacking Taiwan? And what should we think about this question?
That's a variety of angles I should be treating in 2 minutes, because in 2 minutes we should be starting with a Q&A. I'll try my best. So you mean global impact for the whole world or for China, as you said, in the world? Okay. So of course it has a global potential and a global impact, and part of it we have discussed already and we see already. I think it's a rather new thing in Europe and also not in America. America, of course, for historical reasons, already has a very different relationship with the Republic of China, Taiwan. It has the TRA and so on and so forth. But for Europe, I would say until about the year 2018-19, Taiwan was there. It was important, but certainly not in terms of a national security issue, which we now talk about as well. Mark also mentioned it a little bit before. And it certainly was not, I think in Europe we were not aware of the global ramification and implications of a conflict happening in that part of the world, may it be a blockade or a full kinetic conflict. And even 2 years ago, I think, we are in France where we can say that, no disrespect to Macron, but he said we should not be dragged in faraway, distant conflict. Now, all of that, of course, has changed, especially because there's been a variety of think tanks, and two especially that have crunched numbers and attached a price tag to a potential, not only conflict, that was Bloomberg Economic 1 year later, but in 2022 in December it was the Rhodium Group that said how much it would cost us if China even were to just blockade Taiwan. And of course the numbers were $2.5 trillion in yearly annual losses. And I think that for that, crunching numbers, putting a price tag on it, the other number by Bloomberg Economics was actually minus 10% of the global GDP, has really helped the general public, but also I would say policymakers, to understand that it is a choke point. It is, as we all know, I don't need to repeat that, but of course the main point of origin of semiconductors, especially the very small ones, still 90% come out of there. And the ramification, you know more than I do, of course, about AI, but all of these technologies, they need the very small nanometer semiconductors. So when you have the production in Taiwan and global supply chains, open supply chains, depending on that island of 23 million people, you can imagine the potential ripple effects for the rest of the world. So clearly it is a global issue that we now realize. You talked a little bit about trade, Mark, before. For the European Union, but for the world in general, the statistics say that 30 to 50% of all global container ships pass through this strait, through the Taiwan Strait. And we also know, of course, that because of its geographical location, the island and the strait remaining open is important for countries like South Korea and Japan, who also get their their liquefied natural gas through the strait. So it has huge ramification for the whole world. You also once, when we were discussing, Philippe, the panel before, asked how that dents China's image in the global order. And on that, I would just say very quickly, I think it depends which parts of the world we're talking about. So if we look at Europe and the Western world in general, I've just told a little bit about what I think, but of course, it's not just the Taiwan Strait issue or a potential conflict or the trade ramifications, but it is really the fact that we heard before this morning and now, we don't look at China any longer in Europe as purely a business partner anymore, and those times, in my opinion, are gone. They're gone forever. What we now see since 2017 and 18, in the media especially, but also, of course, in various reportages, is the Xinjiang camps, what happened in Hong Kong, is the potential of what could happen in Taiwan, which reinforces our view of China. It's the espionage, it's the oversupply capacity, it's the trade war with America, and we're dumping, of course, of these products. So the Taiwan issue dents China's soft power in that sense, because it adds to another layer of complexity and problems that we see on top of all the, of course, espionage cases we have heard of in Europe, in Germany especially, coming out of China. But in the rest of the world, we also talked a bit about the global south. That's not the case. I mean, Taiwan has lost in its official capacity as Republic of China 10 allies since 2016, when the current party, the DPP, came back to power. And since that moment, the countries that switched, very often when they will actually, of course, change the diplomatic recognition, they will subscribe to a version of a one China policy that is much closer to Beijing's version of the one China principle. We see this also in other economic agreements that China makes with other, for example, places such as islands in the Pacific. All of these places don't care that much about the Taiwan issue. So I would divide the global dent that the Taiwan issue does to China into two parts of the world, the Western world and, to a certain extent, of course, the global South. And I could talk much longer, but we're running out of time. But I just wanted to say something to Mr. Wang. You know, it's not just the Western narrative when it comes to the South China Sea, but there was also, of course, a verdict in 2016 in Den Haag, which China completely disregarded. And China often talks about multilateral institutions and how it respects them. That's not respect, and it's not the narrative, but it's really China doing what it wants. And to that extent, you talked about the fact that other countries in that area of the world are doing the same as China. They are doing that in the vicinity of of their territorial waters. China is doing the same in the vicinity of their territorial waters. It's a very different situation, in my opinion. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Simona. That was great. I just want to go back maybe to Lyle and Mark, asking them whether my question earlier to Cheng about China trying to sort of at least dominate the Indo-Pacific region and perhaps becoming the number one, as opposed to becoming a global power. Is this a valuable way to question this topic we're trying to address of China and the global order? Lyle, perhaps starting with you and then Mark.
Yeah, so really quick, I mean, it depends on who you ask, but I mean, I don't like to use the frame of dominate because it's not empirically measurable, right? So it's under debate. So, you know, hegemonic, dominant, those are subjective terms, right? So I like to use the word influence. You know, I think clearly China wants to influence Indo-Pacific and the globe. They have more influence over the Indo-Pacific because they're closer there. And so does the US. The US has as a resident Indo-Pacific power. So that's sort of the heart of the issue is we both want to influence the region, but we just have different ideas for how to do so, and we have very different ideologies. So again, it's multi-layered, but I'm not comfortable using the word hegemonic and you know, monopolistic because it's got a pejorative term to it. Now, the current Trump administration 100% subscribes to those terms. I, as an analyst, don't, but I think it needs more nuance. But it is important to just point out that Trump and his current policies are using those terms, and they very much believe them, and they use those terms internationally. So as an analyst, I might disagree, quibble over the terms, but I think clearly influence is what China's after in the region, yes.
Great. Mark, very briefly.
Yeah, I do agree. First of all, I would not talk about Indo-Pacific because China does not talk about the Indo-Pacific. Is not a concept in its diplomacy.
Asia.
Yeah. And so again, same remark about domination. But when it comes to East Asia, I mean, it is very clear that China wants to be or to become the hegemon power. I would use the hegemon power in East Asia, and I mean it's very clear in the doctrine, but also in the strategy, in the defense industry. I mean, building up aircraft carrier is not so useful to take over Taiwan, for instance. And it's very clear in the doctrine since the 1980s, 1990s that China wants to be able to wage war beyond the first island chain. And also, perhaps for good reason. I mean, if you look at the East Asian geography, China, 14 kilometers of coastline, is facing a network of US allies, like in South Korea, in Japan, in the Philippines. Taiwan is also a secondary partner of the United States. So I mean, there's also good reason for China to rise, including militarily. But so if there is good reason, still it's a reality that China wants to become an hegemon, including in the South China Sea. I take the point that it's not the PRC that created the nine-dash line, but still the PRC is still claiming it. It's still recognizing it. So okay, it has not created the concept, but I would be also interested to push Zechang a bit forward on what do they claim. As far as I understand, all the territories within the nine-dash line, or perhaps I misunderstood, are claimed to be Chinese territory. I mean, the islands and including and even more so artificial islands. So yes, there is good reasons, but we have to face the reality that China is willing to become the hegemon, and perhaps it's not the best in the best interest of all its neighbors, from India, even Pakistan, to South Korea, and including Southeast Asian countries. It's not necessarily in their best interest.
Okay, great. We don't have a consensus, obviously. We have 10 minutes for a couple of questions. Yes, the lady there. Thank you very much.
Making up for previously, I have a question, and it goes back to all of you on the panel, but particularly my US colleague. We're talking about influence, and I want to keep bringing Africa back on this conversation with China. Because if we're fundamentally talking about influence and China's influence, there's a continent that is actually where China has been, you know, in so many ways, just kind of like defining what influence looks like. And if we look at some, let me use some data point to actually share light on what I'm sharing here. Until the early 2000s, Chinese and US trade with Africa were pretty much on par. Today, Chinese trade with Africa is almost 4 times, let me say this again, 4 times larger than the US trade with the African continent. 4 times, and it's growing, and it's growing, and it's growing. And it's not only Africa, it's the island nations, it's parts of the Pacific. So if we here are talking about, and I think China has a completely different approach that the African continents are much more aligned with, and there are historical conditions that make China a much more attractive partner for many continents. I think DRC right now is a center stage with critical minerals, how this is being played out. And I wonder, like, how do we actually talk about that particular conversation around economic development, China's approach, and how do we reconcile that tension if we are talking about influence and knowing there is a blur between influence and dominance?
It's a great question. We need about 2 hours for that, and we have 5 minutes. So we'll take a couple very quick ones. And yes, gentlemen here, and well, okay, and someone here. Sorry.
Thank you. This has been fascinating. My name is Felipe. I just finished the Schwarzman Scholarship Program at Tsinghua, and I'm here in Paris. I had a question about Europe's role in light of this sort of emerging, now perhaps even arguably Chinese-led order. The last 100 years, Europe has been subject to the whims of others in some sense. In the post-45 period, as de Gaulle very, sort of blatantly said, we were exposed to a dominant currency paradigm where trade was put on US terms. Post-1991, and on the other side of Europe, of course, the Soviet Union setting the terms with the Warsaw Pact. Post-1991, we had the question of neoliberalism, which eventually led to 2008 and has created a sort of a decline spur period in Europe. And so now, to just put that all together, in light of what seems to be an impending collapse of the liberal international order, which we're speaking of, are there particular places, perhaps in the co-construction of defense agreements, in the operationalization of financial currency, where you see Sino-European cooperation to be essential so that Europe doesn't get caught in a squeeze, but can co-participate in some form of creation of the emerging paradigm and world order? Thank you.
Thank you very much. By the way, I'm not biased to Schwarzman scholars. They're just very easy to recognize with their ties. That's the only way. So, sorry, it's just, I didn't mean to do that. But. All right, very quick, please. Yeah.
Quick question, probably for Dr. Wang here. You talked somewhat about BRI. There's about 10 years of data and feedback from it. There's some criticism internationally because of a kind of PR cost, and criticism domestically because of a financial cost. How do you see BRI evolving in the next decade?
All right, so I suggest everybody makes a quick comment response to whatever they want, and then we wrap up. So who wants to start? Simona, you want to start?
I'll just make a quick comment in regards to the first question that you posed in regards to Africa. I think you're totally right. I mean, that's one of the big problems that the West, the United States and Europe have shown in the past 20 years. They have this, you will know more than I do since you asked 2 questions about that topic. The famous phrase, when the West shows up, they give us a sermon. When China shows up, we get a bridge. The problem is, of course, that, as you say, this kind of infrastructure often came with no strings attached. It's not just a rosy picture, though. I mean, in many countries in Africa, you also have backlash against Chinese workers being imported and no local people being given the job. You have problematics attached to it. But, of course, I think that the main problem of the West, I mean, Europe has proposed a couple of options. What was it, Build Back a Better World, and Biden as well, which so far have taken not too much of a space, but to sort of like occupy the space that China's occupied. I think that's the main problem we have had in the West. We have looked the other way. The same thing, Australia in the Pacific region with these islands that you mentioned. And that space that was left in a vacuum was occupied by China, and that's a big problem.
Great. Sichen, do you want to come next?
Thank you for the question. I think when it comes to Africa, for example, the Chinese foreign minister started his year every year with a visit to African countries. And on the other hand, I think, for example, it would be very rare for U.S. Secretary of State or President to visit Africa. So I think China does attach a completely different level of emphasis on Africa. And on the BRI question, to be brief, I think if you really examine the Chinese official statements, the latest characterization is called 小而美, small and beautiful. And so small means like, the sort of investment into these projects would be like considerably smaller than it used to be. Beautiful means like it needs to be more carefully selected. I think the Chinese was like, BI is going to take us another 2 hours, and I think the idea is that I think the Chinese were thinking that they could do something, these projects that are commercially viable by, state-guided, including state bank lending or maybe commercial bank lending. But it turns out to be that a lot of these projects in different countries just commercially it turned out to be very, very challenging. I think it turned out to be more difficult than many of the Chinese expected. And so I think, yes, there is always this saying, Chinese long-term thinking and careful planning, but it is still in a way to find out and in transition into, when it gets more familiar with all these foreign interventions and projects overseas. And I think I just want to respond a little bit. I have my personal opinions about the international arbitration, but I guess big powers just tend to have their ways with international law when it comes to the arbitration or maybe sanctioning international courts, and unfortunately that's the reality we're living with. But I do think the overwhelming majority of jobs created by Chinese investment in Africa are actually taken up by Africans. I think former Secretary of State Mike Pompeo referred to that in one of the speeches, but there are studies from London, I think SOAS, S-O-A-S, and other studies which show like Chinese companies created jobs, and the imported Chinese workers only take up a very tiny percentage of the workforce over there. And on the South China Sea, I'm not particularly an expert, but my understanding is that the 9-dash line is not a legal territorial claim to,
Okay, thank you so much. Very briefly, Mark and Lai, just a couple of words if you can.
Yes, on the Europe-China cooperation, I would not be very optimistic when it comes to trade, to even less so security and defense. But what I can suggest, obviously it's climate, because there is shared interest in dealing with climate change, and China is very well suited to in this realm. And another field which is perhaps a bit more surprising is arms control, because China is experiencing a drastic increase in its nuclear arsenal, which is something quite concerning. There is no more arms control system these days. I don't think that the United States or Russia are the most well-placed to negotiate, and Europe can be, especially France as an independent nuclear power. So this is perhaps something, a field where we can discuss and negotiate.
Lyle, any hope for China and the global order as a concluding remark?
Wow, that's quite a question to leave me with. So to very quickly respond to the first question, I 100% agree with you. No pushback from me. We, the U.S., dropped the ball in Africa starting in the early 2000s. When China had FOCAC, we were watching intently and we had no response to what FOCAC was doing. So I would just add that Africa is a great case study of China meeting the needs of a continent where the U.S. could not. They needed infrastructure. The U.S. was not in a position to do that. And China could offer it at a much cheaper price than any U.S. company could, even Japan. So I give full credit to China. I think the U.S. dropped the ball. And I will just say that closing USAID is the exact worst thing that the U.S. could do when it comes to our Africa policy.
Thank you very much, all four of you. Great Talk in Paris.